Hello, welcome to Manibel, and again, welcome to my deconstruction of Hume's book, A Treatise of Human Nature. And I did some thinking about how to represent my own particular understanding of causation. And it may take a few goes. I'll try to do it as best as I can because there's a bit of a explanation that I have to present something before I can sort of get to the definition. But that's how I work. I want to structure things. I don't want to just come up with shit. I want it to be simple and understandable and so on, right? It might be sort of, in some cases, slightly more simplified that it could possibly be in optimal fashion, but I would rather have the understanding coming through than it be perfectly deciphered, right? Okay, you get my point, I hope. Okay, so let's take it structured, right? We have an idea of time. We can use that so far in Hume, right? And I would have the same understanding, right? We can use perceptions and we can use memories, right? So these are foundations for going for causation that has to be before we get we can't use something that we would understand as something that might be after causation in an explanation of causation. Then it would be circular, right? So I'm going to use time, perception, and memories as a foundation for understanding what causation is. And I think that Hume would be in agreement with this, at least the approach. Not necessarily conclusion, but at least the approach, right? Okay, so let's say at time one, we have perception one. And by perception one, I mean a set of qualia and concepts and whatever follows from that can possibly be memorized. And I see a memory as a series of sort of snapshots of perceptions, right? And that's a slightly simpler way of seeing it. I would agree with that. But it's in order to have a clear understanding or something that we can discuss here, right? Okay, so as time goes, as they say, right? At time two, there's perception two. But then at perception two, perception one is a memory. Potentially a memory, right? Let's say that all perceptions in this course here becomes a memory, right? Or at least it's not necessarily the next perception or situation that follows immediately from time one to time two, but it's the next perception that is in my memory, you could say, right? That's maybe a better way to put it. At time three, there's perception three that can potentially become a part of, or will become a part of my memory. But at time three, at time two, there's perception two, but in the memory, there's perception one, right? At time three, there's perception three, but in the memory, there's perception one and perception two. At time four, there's perception four, but in the memory, there's perception one, perception two, and following perception one, followed by perception two, followed by perception three, right? So, and maybe there's a small error in my no, maybe this is a good way of doing it. And so forth and so forth, right? At time 11, there's perception 11, but in the memory, there's perception 1, followed by perception 2, followed by perception 3, followed by perception 4, and 5, and 6, and 7, all the way to perception 10, right? So you understand what I'm trying to present here, right? So it's sort of a simplified way of dealing with that. The actual perception now is not a part of memory before it is superseded by the next perception. Whether or not a perception in the now is also a memory in the now, I don't know. But as soon as there's a new perception, and that is sort of almost instantly, right? Then that prior perception is now merely a memory, if it's at all a memory, right? But those memories that I have perception I am talking about in the memory are I am presenting it this way, right? You could say, if I have a perception, that might not be identical as a memory, but in order to, I mean, the perception version of P1 might not be completely identical to the memory of P1. But in order to simplify the presentation here, I'm just calling both of them P1, right? Okay, and the memory of P1 and P2 and so on might just be that which the memory considers an important aspect of that particular perception. But in order to not confuse things, I'm just calling the perception P1 and the memory perception also P1, right? Okay, so what I'm saying here is that if the situations in P1, P4, and P8, and these are, if you look up here, there's P1 and followed by P2, and then there's P4 followed by P5 and so on, right? I could have highlighted P1 and P2 all the way down, but I just pointed to particular perceptions following other perceptions within this pyramidal structure here, right, in memories. And if the situations in P1, P4, and P8 are identical among them, that is, by that I mean that the situation, how it's composed in perception 1 is identical to perception, or the memory of perception 1 is identical to the memory of perception 4, which is identical to the memory of perception 8. Then there is the same situation among them, right? And I call that S1 as situation 1, right? And then when I compare my memories to the immediate next perception, or maybe it could be not necessarily the immediate, but maybe 3 steps ahead. It could also be that, but for simplicity here, right? There's some perception after that seems to be also identical among them, that P2, P5, and P9 are also identical among them, right? Among themselves, which I would call situation 2. Then there's a pattern here, right? Whenever there is a situation 1, situation 2 always seems to follow, right? It doesn't always seem to follow. That's a wrong way of putting it. My memory says to me, whenever I have a situation, a perception that matches situation 1, it seems that situation 2 will follow based on my memories, right? So the causation that the mind creates is, if situation 1, then situation 2 will follow in the future. That's the causation step, right? It's a it's a comparison of memories. And it's an identification of a particular pattern, right? There's nothing that says that situation 1 and situation 2 will follow in the future. When you are at time 12, which is my sort of idea of a potential future, there will be perception 12. Nobody says that situation 1 will occur or situation 2 will occur. Nobody says that if situation 1 occurs in the future, that it must be situation 2 following it at some point, right? It doesn't follow. But each time I have had the situation, then within a certain, right? Let's say that at time 12, over in the memories, I had P11, perception 11. And that perception 11 matches situation 1. Would it be reasonable to think that situation 2 will follow? It's up to you, right? I can't say that I have experience of some causation out there and therefore, no. All these causations that I imagine are that. They are imagined, right? As I state down here in red. Causation, therefore, is an axiomatic decision to expect a particular outcome of a given situation based on comparisons of memories. This cannot be a perception, right? Causation cannot be a perception. It's completely ruled out here because it is about comparing memories of perceptions, right? Now, when you predict something, you are going through a case of having to have a perception of that which you predict, according to your constructed causation, right? If I have P11 and it is identical to situation 1, I expect there to be some P12 in the future that matches situation 2. But I will have to be there at time 12 in order to verify it, right? I mean, otherwise I wouldn't have the causation of it. I wouldn't confirm I would not have a memory of it. I wouldn't be able to create a memory of it, right? The causation is based on a pattern in the memories, but in order to use this pattern, I have to be there in the now at the point of situation 2 in order to confirm that there's a causation, or to confirm that it fits with my constructed causation. I'm not saying that it is there in the experience. Careful, right? So, just trying to juggle these various things is it's always a good idea when you philosophize to make these kinds of structured ways of thinking, right? And you might have to modify it a bit here and there. It's always iterations of getting more clear in your argumentation. But this is how I understand causation. And to the best of my understanding so far with Hume, we are basically on top of each other philosophically, right? Okay, so let me go back to normality here. And we are going into why a cause is always necessary.
File 18 of A Treatise of Human Nature by David Hume, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by George Yeager. Book 1, Part 3. Section 3. Why is a cause always necessary? To begin with the first question concerning the necessity of a cause, it is a general maxim in philosophy that whatever begins to exist must have a cause of existence. This is commonly taken for granted in all reasonings without any proof given or demanded. It is supposed to be founded on intuition and to be one of those maxims which, though they may be denied with the lips, it is impossible for men in their hearts really to doubt of. But if we examine this maxim by the idea of knowledge above explained, we shall discover in it no mark of any such intuitive certainty, but on the contrary shall find that it is of a nature quite foreign to that species of conviction. All certainty arises from the comparison of ideas, and from the discovery of such relations as are unalterable so long as the ideas continue the same. These relations are resemblance, proportions in quantity and number, degrees of inequality, and contrariety, none of which are implied in this proposition. Whatever has a beginning has also a cause of existence. That proposition, therefore, is...
Now I'm jumping in here. I'm just, thinking out loud, right? It seems like these kinds of argumentations very quickly become circular. When you go, in my opinion, the deeper you go to the starting point of your philosophy, the more likely is you're going to make as begging the question fallacy, right? Now, if you're saying something, Hume, I'm just riffing on this. It's not a critique of Hume, actually not a deconstruction. While it's in my mind, so to say, right? whatever has a beginning also has a cause of existence. But that beginning is a cause in itself, right? And I don't think that existence pops out of any sense of time or any sense of causation. It seems like it's this circular fact. There is, because this happens, there's causation. Because there's causation, there's a beginning, and then there's something at the beginning, and it's sort of, no, it starts to become circular, right? It's just a reminder that be careful that you're not using circular argumentation, right? It's when you go from the when you go from the, let's say, end of metaphysics to the start of metaphysics in your philosophy, it's very likely that you're going to bring something along that doesn't belong there, rather than getting to a starting point which is a reduction base where you can reduce it any further and then build from that, right? Establish from that. Get back to where you sort of want to go. I don't want, maybe that's a wrong way of putting it, because you have to encompass all of it in your philosophy. Otherwise, I will have to deduce that you're trying to trick me. You're cherry picking your way to the answers you want, right? So just when you're digging down, when you are, as mostly I hear Hume do, right? Although he has presented his impression and ideas, the way he's these talking points of causation, then he goes the other way, which is kind of annoying, right? That he said, okay, now I've done some idea and impression, right? And now I'm going to take this particular talking point called causation, and now I'm going from causation, trying to dig back to my reduction base. I don't find that approach necessarily a good approach, because you might bring along some circular reasoning that is not going to work, right? Okay.
Is not intuitively certain. At least anyone who would assert it to be intuitively certain must deny these to be the only infallible relations, and must find some other relation of that kind to be implied in it, which it will then be time enough to examine. But here is an argument which proves at once that the foregoing proposition is neither intuitively nor demonstrably certain. We can never demonstrate the necessity of a cause to every new existence or new modification of existence without shewing at the same time the impossibility there is that anything can ever begin to exist without some productive principle. And where the latter proposition cannot be proved, we must despair of ever being able to prove the former. Now that the latter proposition is utterly incapable of a demonstrative proof, we may satisfy ourselves by considering that as all distinct ideas are separable from each other, and as the ideas of cause and effect are evidently distinct, it will be easy for us to conceive any object to be non-existent this moment and existent the next, without conjoining to it the distinct idea of a cause or productive principle. The separation, therefore, of the idea of a cause from that of a beginning of existence is plainly possible for the imagination, and consequently the actual separation of these objects is so far possible that it implies no contradiction nor absurdity, and is therefore incapable of being refuted by any reasoning from mere ideas, without which it is impossible to demonstrate the necessity of a cause. Accordingly, we shall find upon examination that every demonstration which has been produced for the necessity of a cause is fallacious and sophistical. All the points of time and place, say some philosophers, Mr. Hobbes, in which we can suppose any object to begin to exist are in themselves equal, and unless there be some cause which is peculiar to one time and to one place, and which by that means determines and fixes the existence, It must remain in eternal suspense, and the object can never begin to be for want of something to fix its beginning. But I ask, is there any more difficulty in supposing the time and place to be fixed without a cause than to suppose the existence to be determined in that manner? The first question that occurs on this subject is always whether the object shall exist or not. The next, when and where it shall begin to exist. If the removal of a cause be intuitively absurd in the one case, it must be so in the other. And if that absurdity be not clear without a proof in the one case, it will equally require one in the other. The absurdity, then, of the one supposition can never be a proof of that of the other, since they are both upon the same footing, and must stand or fall by the same reasoning. The second argument, Dr. Clarke and others, which I find used on this head, labors under an equal difficulty. Everything, it is said, must have a cause, for if anything wanted a cause, it would produce itself. That is.
No, but it's this. I have an experience of things changes, therefore it must have a cause. But you're basically inferring to magic, right? Maybe not magic, but you're saying there must be something I can't access. Well, yeah, but that something is in your mind. It's not out there, right? And it's sort of a possibly a spin-off of bad metaphysics, which is the materialist, right? That what I experience is an actual outside. And because that which I'm referring to, which is that those things that are potentially, inflicted with causation is out there, then causation must also be out there somehow, right? It's sort of similar to gravitation, that gravitation is sort of a bending of space or something like that, right? But you don't experience space, right? You have a sense of space in your mind, but that doesn't mean that you can experience gravity, for instance, but you can experience the effects of gravity, you could say, right? So there is some cause behind it, which we just say, okay, I come up with a model that says space is bending, and because it's bending, it is sort of exerting a force that I'm then experiencing, right? So it's sort of a story behind the experience, which I then classify as a cause. And then the effect, right? Then the cause is the bending of space. But I'm not experiencing bending of space in the same fashion that I'm not experiencing the cause that leads to the effect, which is what I feel when I jump from the Eiffel Tower, right? Don't do this at home, please. So, and in fact, you could argue that Einstein says you can't experience gravity. It's only when something else comes in your way of the way you move because of gravity that you all of a sudden feel when you hit the ground after the Eiffel Tower, right? Then you will feel something. You're not feeling gravity. You're feeling the opposite force of that which is in your way, right?
Exist before it existed, which is impossible. But this reasoning is plainly unconclusive, because it supposes that in our denial of a cause, we still grant what we expressly deny. That is, that there must be a cause which therefore is taken to be the object itself, and that, no doubt, is an evident contradiction. But to say that anything is produced, or to express myself more properly, comes into existence without a cause, is not to affirm that it is itself its own cause, but on the contrary, in excluding all external causes, excludes a fortiori the thing.
Is all sorts of, in my opinion, revolves around the the presentation I made. It's this mix up of memory of what happened, of prior perceptions, the actual perception, and imagination of a future perception. If you have had a perception that matches the same situation, at least to some extent, in a particular aspect of that situation, then that situation or particular aspect of that situation will follow according to your memories of that situation and how it unfolds after that. But that is just in your memory. These are comparisons of memories, right? You could say, well, then why would I have these memories and this comparison and create this idea of causation? I can't tell you, but it seems to be going on. So therefore, I'm fine with appealing to causation as a part of my mind, right? It's not some kind of glue or whatever chain or elastic that combines object in a certain way, right? The idea of gravitation and gravitational fields or distortions of space or whatever it is, these are basically just stories that creates an idea of things going on between your perceptions that you can't perceive, and therefore explaining some kind of cause or adding some cause that explains the effects, maybe, right? But these are models. I mean, bending of space is a model. It's not an experience, right? It's not a perception. You can't perceive bending of space, right? If you say that, you're fucking crazy, right? So it's the mix of models and perceptions that is arriving at some kind of perception model mix that explains scientific causation, causalities, and so on, right? And that these models that are actually made there to fit the narrative, fit the evidence, so to say, right? And create stories of causation. That doesn't make it so just because you created a model that explains it, right? Because if you work from the idea of causation, then the idea of causation influences those models you created in order to explain the effects. So you're creating the cause and the cause of the effect, right? Or the causation between cause and effect, right? So just be careful that you're not bringing too much to the table and then you're saying that's what's out there, right? Just be careful.
Itself, which is created. An object that exists absolutely without any cause certainly is not its own cause. And when you assert that the one follows from the other, you suppose the very point in question and take it for granted that it is utterly impossible anything can ever begin to exist without a cause, but that upon the exclusion of one productive principle, we must still have recourse to another.
To best of my understanding, that's what Hume is trying to say, with that which I just pointed out, that the perception have been expanded upon using some models of scientific theorization, and then I'm adding these models to the story of my perception, mixing my memories and my immediate perception and so on, creating a story that makes these various sort of fraction perceptions, you could say, into a whole story. And then that whole story becomes my reality, but not realizing that I've added stuff to that reality that I do not perceive, right? And that's why the idea of the scientific causation, the completely determined universe as such, you can always come up with some story that fits your narrative of fraction perceptions that has to be fit into a bigger picture if you create the picture yourself according to your fancy, right? That doesn't explain anything. So just be careful about this understanding. This is scientific. I understand the whole universe as 13.9 billion years ago, and I go this way, and all is causally connected, and no, this is basically a story. I'm not saying it's not a functional story. I would say it is. But be careful that you're not using your story to prove something or reject something, right? Just roll it back a bit and be a little humble, right?
It is exactly the same case with the third argument, Mr. Locke, which has been employed to demonstrate the necessity of a cause. Whatever is produced without any cause is produced by nothing, or, in other words, has nothing for its cause. But nothing can never be a cause, no more than it can be something, or equal to two right angles. By the same intuition that we perceive nothing not to be equal to two right angles, or not to be something, we perceive that it can never be a cause, and consequently must perceive that every object has a real cause of its existence. I believe it will not be necessary to employ many words.
You know, the Big Bang is a backwards prediction of imagined perceptions as far back as you can possibly get, right? If I have a memory and then these, memory of this experiment and this telescope and this guy who said that and that woman who said that and so on, back in time, back in the idea of time, then how far can I roll that back? That is sort of the exercise of the Big Bang. Personally, I don't give a fuck about the Big Bang because it doesn't change whatever is here at this point in time, right? I'm not saying that I can't move myself around and position myself according to what I think might be the case in the future. But it's the extension of, if you just think of human beings have been around for, a split second of the history of Earth, right? Or in the history of the universe. And we have sort of a perception in the moment and a few memories of perception in back in time, so to say. And then it sort of ends, and then there's sort of a gazillion of imagined possible perceptions back in time, which is sort of a story we just tell ourselves. It is just based on this very short interval that we have been possibly able to have ourselves or have a memory of, or somebody telling us that they have experienced, or telling about their memories and so on, right? Or describing their perception in the moment in a scientific observation of stars or whatever, right? Galaxies and so on. And then write that down, and then it becomes a memory, and then we extend that memory back 13 point whatever it is, 7 billion years, right? Into an observation, an imagined observation of what's going on down there. It is kind of crazy to try to deal with that, right? But it's based on the idea of this causality back in time, so to say, right? Because there was something of this that in the picture I showed you before, not in my picture, not all perceptions had a cause, but then when you analyze it, it seems like whenever there's a particular perception, a particular cause should follow, right? When you really analyze it, and that makes it feel like that universe is completely deterministic, and therefore scientists are very, prone to classifying free will as an illusion, right? Because it doesn't fit with the picture of, the causal universe and the brain made of fat or whatever it is, particular molecules that should somehow encompass a mind that has free will. There's a free will that appears out of this causal structure that science is working from, though forgetting that most of that causal universe is completely made up. I'm not saying it's magic or fantasy, but it is added artificially as models for cause and effect. Right? Okay, let's not go further into that.
Words ensuing the weakness of this argument after what I have said of the foregoing. They are all of them founded on the same fallacy and are derived from the same turn of thought. It is sufficient only to observe that when we exclude all causes, we really do exclude them, and neither suppose nothing nor the object itself to be the causes of the existence, and consequently can draw no argument from the absurdity of these suppositions to prove the absurdity of that exclusion. If everything must have a cause, it follows that upon the exclusion of other causes, we must accept of the object itself or of nothing as causes. But it is the very point in question whether everything must have a cause or not. And therefore, according to all just reasoning, it ought never to be taken for granted. They are still more frivolous who say that every effect must have a cause because it is implied in the very idea of effect. Every effect necessarily presupposes a cause, effect being a relative term of which cause is the correlative. But this does not prove
No,
that every being
it's like, but I use the term effect, so there must be a cause, right? It's just like when Bernardo Castro says, "Well, my perception is a dashboard." Oh, by the way, a dashboard is something that is a representation of something outside the dashboard. Therefore, there must be an outside, right? The same kind of stupid, lame argumentation, right? It is really stupid. I'm not saying that it disproves that it is, in the Bernardo Castro's case, disproves that there is an outside, but the structure of the argumentation is basically fucking crazy, right?
must be preceded by a cause, no more than it follows, because every husband must have a wife, that therefore every man must be married. The true state of the question is whether every object which begins to exist must owe its existence to a cause. And this I assert neither to be intuitively nor demonstratively certain, and hope to have proved it sufficiently by the foregoing arguments. Since it is not from knowledge or any scientific reasoning that we derive the opinion of the necessity of a cause to every new production, that opinion must necessarily arise from observation and experience. The next question, then, should naturally be how experience gives rise to such a principle. But as I find it will be more convenient to sink this question in the following, why we conclude that such particular causes must necessarily have such particular effects, and why we form an inference from one to the other. We shall make that the subject of our future inquiry. It will perhaps be found in the end that the same answer will serve for both questions. End of file 18. File 19 of a Treatise of Human Nature.
All right, that's the part end of section 4 of part 2, or if I remember correctly. Section 3, part 2, right? Yeah. It's a little annoying the way he argues. He's very good at, these enveloped kind of, and then he says, yeah, okay, and I think I have pointed out that it isn't good argumentation, so therefore I'll tell you about it later. Okay, fair enough. It could possibly comes here in section 4 of the component parts of our reasonings concerning cause and effect, the component parts. So he's trying to decipher, he's trying to split it up, he's trying to deconstruct the argument of, and try to look what is there, right? If there's nothing left, then there can't be causation, right? Okay, I think that I will keep a further discussion of cause and effect until it's sort of rounded up in his philosophy and try to decipher what he actually how he actually argues, and the crutch of it might be that if he finds some aspect where he can say, well, therefore you can't talk about cause and effect, or therefore you can only infer it, it's not something you can experience, fine, I will keep it until then, right? So let's just say we'll stop here and see each other in the next part, right? Please share, subscribe, and otherwise, have a nice day. See you in the next one.